This is the third day. I think we're all a little tired, maybe. And unfortunately, my lecture is a bit long. I've cut, but it's 3 parts, okay? So I'm duly challenged, if not somewhat intimidated, by the sheer density of content in this conference, driven by the urgency of its primary concern, justice, in short supply in our country at the moment. So this talk, I should prepare you, is somewhat schematic insofar as it is structured in 3 parts. Each of these parts draws on examples of transitional justice, performative justice, and a search for justice through images in a state of systemic forgetting, which is a leitmotif that runs through the talk. My examples are drawn primarily from the cultures of the South, notably South Africa, Rwanda, and India. I've not attempted to synthesize my examples around transnational historical concerns. Instead, I will adopt a broadly performative methodology to focus on a key question or problem in each of the 3 parts, which I will attempt to address in context, but also with an eye on the larger journey of the talk as it thinks through the breakthroughs and dead ends in seeking justice outside the law. So let me begin by saying that I have no background in law whatsoever. I have never engaged with the law directly as a writer, except perhaps in my last book, The Second Wave, where I have made a very modest intervention. On the one hand, I don't have the expertise to deconstruct its language, the letter of the law. But on the other hand, more critically, I often get the feeling that the law would not be interested in considering issues that I regard as unjust in my cultural practice and theoretical concerns. So to put it bluntly, I feel a sense of exclusion from the law, even as I am not against the law. We need law more urgently than ever before, but if the institution of law is inaccessible or recalcitrant in delivering our justice, or simply unjust in the pronouncement of some of its sentences, as Gayatri Spivak in her opening address made it very clear that justice and law should not be seen synonymously. They have a disjunctive relationship. So if we have all these problems with the law, then we as civilians need to activate justice in our own forums and constituencies, whether that happens to be a school, whether that happens to be a theater, or whatever. So call this a search for justice by default, outside the law, or in certain instances, as it might be perceived, against the law. The contradictions and vulnerabilities of this search provide the framework for my talk. So, what kind of justice am I interested in engaging with? I would say that justice involves, first of all, the recognition of a crime or atrocity without equivocation or the camouflage of a cover-up. I realize that this is a somewhat idealistic first premise. Second, I would acknowledge the need for some arbitration or the capacity to listen to the circumstances of the crime without resorting to vigilante justice or the frenzied cry for capital punishment, which is getting louder and louder in India today. And let's face it, it's really hard to argue sometimes against capital punishment when the crime in question is so brutal. I'm thinking of Jyoti Singh's brutal murder. And I'm thinking most of all of her mother, who demanded that the rapist should be executed. And that was a very, very fervent plea, but on moral and ethical grounds, I find it impossible to accept capital punishment. Now, if this sounds like a far too non-violent approach to justice, I would emphasize quite unequivocally that there can be no justice without punishment for perpetrators of crimes. So in this sense, one could argue that I'm upholding a retributive form of justice without the necessary legal technicalities relating to the proportionality needed in balancing the severity of the crime with its punishment. Proportionality, that's a technical issue. In culturalist terms, it would be much easier for me to move in the direction of restorative justice, where the onus of responsibility shifts to the offenders, who are made to recognize their responsibility for the crimes, leading to an opportunity to understand and possibly to redeem their actions through dialogue with the victims, followed by action. Now, this indeed is the thrust of most of my examples in this talk, but I think I would be seriously misrepresenting, if not censoring myself, if I didn't reiterate the imperative for punishment. A world in which killers can get away with their crimes and revert to normalcy is not one that I can accept. So let's begin with the first part. What is the question? If a country or nation is faced with a crisis of staggering proportions that is widely acknowledged, and if the legal system with uncharacteristic modesty actually accepts its inability to deal with the crisis, then how does one arrive at an alternative apparatus of justice? Is one actually confronting the crisis in positing an alternative, or passing the buck? This looks like a regular courtroom, doesn't it? There's an audience of spectators facing what appears to be a judge in purple robes. I'm trying to find, yeah, he's right here, okay? And he's sitting alongside legal representatives in civil clothes, seated on what appears to be a higher platform. It's not a higher platform. In direct contact with these luminaries, a sole female witness, you see her right there, faces them in what appears to be a hearing. To the side, we see glass booths over there. Sorry, I got it wrong. So the glass booths are out there, in which translators are barely visible, and that's not a feature that one normally finds in most regular courtrooms, which tend to be monolingual. If you look carefully, there's a woman sitting alongside the witness, she's almost hidden, who is designated as a carer to comfort the witness during her testimony. Yet again, not a feature that one finds in a regular courtroom. Let's face it, this is not a court. It's a simulation of a court, a performative enactment of a quasi-legal proceeding. It is one of the 2,140 hearings that were represented in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the TRC, at that critical point in time in the history of South Africa in 1995, as it attempted to transition from the violence of the apartheid era into a more humane society. It would not be an exaggeration to say that the transition continues. Why was it necessary to initiate the TRC in the first place? The received opinion by both the official representatives of the discredited apartheid regime and revolutionary heir apparent Nelson Mandela is that without a procedure of transitional justice, the country was likely to face civil war. Echoing Karl von Clausewitz, I believe that arguments attempting to circumvent war without recognizing its perpetuation through other forms of imagined peace could be deceptive. Underlying this deception, I would highlight the central condition that enabled the TRC to happen in the first place, the possibility of amnesty available to those perpetrators of political crimes that enable them to legitimize their actions, often without the semblance of remorse. Much has been written about the shortcuts of the TRC that fail to address the everyday violence of apartheid. And I think we really have to put this on the agenda. It's not just the big moments, it's the everyday violence, the everyday atrocities and Dalits that we have to be dealing with, right? Apart from the economic violence that enabled elite families and corporations to reinforce their power in the post-apartheid state, business as usual. Political economist Moletsi Mbeki younger brother and critic of Thabo Mbeki, former president of South Africa, has forcefully highlighted the strategically worked out historical compromise that failed to address the urgent need for economic redistribution. In a more passionate moral register, Mahmoud Mamdani called out this compromise as nothing less than an embrace of evil. Now, the choice of the word evil is particularly strong, not least because it targets the larger ethos of forgiveness in a predominantly Christian register that was affirmed by the TRC's most charismatic master of ceremonies, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, the guy you saw in the purple robes. Shrewdly, or wisely, or both, Tutu supplemented the Christian ethos of forgiveness with the African concept of Ubuntu, a form of reciprocal relationality whereby the definition of who one is determined by who we all are. A deeply magnanimous concept, no doubt, but not free of self-interest, as the Archbishop had the candor to point out. In a more legal register, cultural theorist Adam Seitz links the application of Ubuntu to conditional amnesty, which apartheid jurists had legislated as indemnity. Okay. So, while drawing on these legal terms and conditions, my critique of the TRC is more grounded in its valorization of affect, whereby something on the lines of emotional truth or personal truth was allowed a voice through the medium of storytelling and testimonies to supplement, but not to replace, forensic truth required of all conventional codes of law. I would emphasize that if we are seeking some relationship of affect to effect, to actual changes on the ground in the lives of people, then performance cannot be relied upon as a stable signifier. This is the second leitmotif that runs through my talk, and I request you to pick up on the resonances. Perhaps the central significance of any performance is that it does not last. Mutability and disappearance are written into its ontology. While memories survive, they can be dodgy and painful, particularly in instances of trauma. Above all, the relationship between performance and truth is based on lies. No one understood this more powerfully than Georges Genet, who will make a brief appearance in the next section. There can be nothing like an absolute truth in the theater, except perhaps in some religious performance traditions that I happen to respect. But if we are seeking truth in a legal sense, even outside the strictures of the law, then the apparatus underlying its performance needs to be sustained in practice. It has to last, okay? Let me turn at this point to the archetypal figure of Nomonde Kalata, who provided a searing testimony of her anti-apartheid activist husband's murder by the South African police. At some point in her testimony, as we learn from numerous reports and fictions that I've discussed in my book, Terror and Performance, Mrs. Kalata threw back her head and cried. It was not so much a cry as a howl, a wail, that was interpreted as, quote, the defining sound of the TRC, a cry from the soul, a nation coming to terms with itself. I don't wish to undermine the cumulative emotional impact of this moment that was mediatized at a national level through numerous radio and television broadcasts. But I do wish to question how it was used by the state and the impossible machine of the TRC, as Adam Seitz has described the intricate bureaucratic structure of its different committees, where the onus of storytelling was linked to the availability of reparations. Forget reparations. When they eventually materialized, they amounted to a pittance, less than $4,000. More unpardonably, it is the systemic forgetting of the victim after telling her story that strikes at the heart of how a quasi-legal apparatus can use the catharsis of a heart-rending real-life story to enhance the transformative credentials of its own narrative without following up on the victim's life. Such was the case with Nomonde Kalata. When theatre scholar Catherine Cole visited her at her home after her cry had circulated in the public domain, she asked Mrs. Kalata what she felt about her cry being repeated, to which Mrs. Kalata said, "I'm still crying, but there's no one to listen." For me, these words resonate injustice at a personal level, compelling me to think about what it would have been like if instead of truth and reconciliation, it would have been possible to engage with rage and reconciliation. Systemic forgetting is part of the larger narrative of unacknowledged rage in our times, in response to which, in my view, no reconciliation is possible. So let me turn now to a far more risky experiment in searching for justice. This experiment also wanted reconciliation at a massive level, but its methods were entirely different. And I think we need to be attentive to the fact that when you try to practice justice outside the law, there's no one route, okay? So in this experiment happened following the genocide in Rwanda between April to July 1994. A genocide resulting from inter-ethnic clashes largely between the Hutu and the Tutsi, resulting in at least 800,000 casualties in approximately 100 days. As we know, this tragedy could have been minimized, if not averted, if the United Nations had intervened promptly, instead of prevaricating in its usual mode of non-action, which arguably is another form of injustice. In the aftermath of this genocide, it is said that only 5 judges and 50 lawyers remained alive in the country. All social structures were decimated. In this state of emergency, one has to give due credit, I believe, to the surviving Rwandan government that resolved to arrive at its own solution for a problem of its own making. They didn't duck that responsibility. Desmond Tutu's offer to mediate was politely turned down. Above all, the basic premise of amnesty that had compromised the TRC model of justice was rejected on the ethical grounds that perpetrators of crimes need to be punished through trials. What does one do if over 1 million Tutsis and moderate Hutus have been killed, 400,000 women widowed, 500,000 children orphaned? How does one begin to arbitrate justice in such a calamitous condition? Audaciously, the government decided that it would mobilize justice through gacaca, a reinvented form of local conflict resolution and arbitration of disputes practiced in the rural areas of Rwanda over the years. Gacaca literally means short grass, and by extension, judgment on grass. Now, in this image, it doesn't seem to be very different from, let's say, a panchayat meeting almost anywhere in rural India. And yet, as legal scholar Lars Waldorf has pointed out, this reinvented gacaca, and what you're seeing here is reinvented gacaca, has little to do with its more authentic mode of customary dispute resolution, where the sessions are a lot more intimate, involving only the families having a dispute, I believe only the male members of the family, along with local elders providing the necessary arbitration and advice. Now, with the reinvented gacaca, this grassroots model of justice did not merely grow in size and significance, it got nationalized. So much so, I have to quote the number here, 1,210,368 gacaca sessions were held in the course of 5 years, beginning in 2002. Attendance was made compulsory for all adult Rwandans, resulting in considerable difficulties in people traveling long distances, sustaining their livelihood, apart from living with fear, as they endured a form of grassroots surveillance by which attendance was monitored. So I'm going to show you just 2 images of gacaca, just to give you some idea of how it actually worked. So in this image, you see the judges, plain clothes, including women. They're sitting behind a desk, okay? There's this guy in a very multicolored t-shirt who's giving his testimony through a microphone. The entire community is there. You'll see a lot of kids over there. There's a multicolored umbrella in the background. It does look very festive. So you can see this is a very, very informal way of arbitrating justice, you know. People sitting on the grass, listening, but be warned, these are the darkest of crimes, okay? So who is going to judge the gacaca sessions? 250,000 judges, the Inyanga Mugayo, or persons of integrity, were formally elected in 2001 with a voter turnout as high as 87%. Now I'm giving you these statistics just to tell you, if you want another apparatus of justice, you have to work at it. You have to build it. It's not automatically there. And we have to give credit to the Rwandan government. It didn't spare itself. There's a lot of work that has gone into this process. Inevitably, there were problems, beginning with the week-long crash course in jurisprudence given to the Inyanga Mugayo. Now they were no longer dealing with family disputes, but crimes bordering on what I would describe as the unthinkable. For instance, a youth being ordered to rape his mother, with his younger siblings facilitating the rape, with the militia pointing their guns at the children. A woman, formerly a kind soul, killing the children of a neighbor on the grounds that they would be better off. Here we are dealing with the most virulent, the most perverse forms of evil, to use Mahmoud Mamdani's category, where neighbors become killers overnight, and we have many instances of that in our country as well. Now, apart from charges of corruption and incompetence, this is important. There was a fundamental discrepancy that was built into the post-genocide legal system, insofar as all crimes committed by the predominantly Tutsi-dominated Rwandan Patriotic Front were tried only in state courts, which means that they continued, while all crimes committed by the Hutu, implicitly condemned as genocidal, were negotiated exclusively in the gacaca sessions. So it becomes clear that ethnicity continued to be a marker of legal differentiation, even as all ethnic categories were legally outlawed by the government in the aftermath of the genocide, and that continues to be the case to this day. So if you go to Rwanda, everyone will know, okay, that's Hutu, that person's Tutsi, but you don't talk about it. You don't articulate it. Now there's only one category that you can use, Rwandan. I will leave you to translate that, the possibilities of that in our context. It doesn't sound too great to me. Now, my intervention in this scenario relates to the invisible yet omnipresent role played by the state in orchestrating peace across victims and perpetrators through one of the largest cultural agendas in mobilizing conflict resolution through song, dance, music, storytelling, and testimonials. Massive. In one such workshop, documented by Ananda Breed, whose book has been published by Seagull, we're introduced to a woman marked as a victim who's breastfeeding her child during a break in the workshop. She's sitting alongside a male perpetrator. At one point she says, "When I do theater, I forget that this man here killed my 5 children." Let's repeat that sentence in the third person. When this woman does theater, she forgets that the man sitting alongside her killed her 5 children. How can one even begin to comprehend such forgetting? Only by closely working through the words of the woman, as I've tried to do in my chapter on Rwanda in Terror and Performance, then the words ultimately are very revealing, do we realize that there's an unconscious shift from the first person to the second person to the third person in the woman's statement, in which it becomes clear that while we are listening to her voice, the script has already been prepared by the state. I would characterize this script as being marked by coercive forgiveness. This becomes clearer in the fact-finding reports of the Penal Reform International, where a woman expresses her position in a forthright manner, quote, "The government has forgiven you and me. I cannot refuse it to you." The double negative is revelatory about the woman's fraught agency. If she cannot refuse forgiveness, it's obvious she has no other choice but to forgive. But is this forgiveness? And indeed, can this be regarded as justice? Part 2. Sorry. So in this section, I'm going to be talking about prison theater. And I'm going to be narrating one particular experience for which I have no images. So I thought that maybe many people here in the audience may never have seen prison theater or engaged with prison theater. So I'm going to show you 3 images of prison theater from an earlier workshop at the Westville Correctional Center, directed by my friend Christopher John. So this is what we would call image theater. Image theater is one of the many constructions of Augusto Boal, where the actors create an image around a social situation or whatever, which is then interrogated and changed. So in this particular image theater, we're seeing a family brawl where the father is wreaking havoc on all the children. So patriarchy at work. Here, of course, we are seeing a hold-up, and employers are being held up with a gun, which is quite common in South Africa. And here, of course, another political crime. So all you need to know here is all the people you're seeing here are inmates of Westville Correctional Center. They are performing in a room in the Westville Correctional Center. There are no sets, lights, costumes, makeup, etc. They're just using their own bodies and voices to enact scenes from their life. So this is how basically this kind of theater works. So let me turn now to a brief description of my own work at Westville. I'll give a little background here because of teachers here, many of whom may be interested. This work can be linked to the larger practice of applied theater, where the techniques, conventions, narratives, and acting methodologies in regular theater practice are recontextualized and applied to social and civic institutions like prisons. It can be applied to schools. And this theater is done to deal with specific problems faced by the inmates of these institutions, occasionally their administrators, in a broader context of reflexive learning, therapy, and healing. So, what are the questions? I would ask, what happens when applied theater practitioners intervene in the search for justice in a tense situation, in a prison or rehabilitation center or war zone that results in a violent backlash? However well-intentioned, can the right to intervene, to use Shwetan Todorov's category, justify unprecedented violence resulting from cultural intervention? Or is it better to settle, in his words, for the duty to assist? The right to intervene through cultural practice in a prison cannot be taken for granted. You can't just walk into a prison and start doing theater. Far from being an entirely voluntarist or personal act, it is made possible through institutional mediations, beginning with the prison itself, but also extending to other civic institutions. So my intervention in Westville was made possible through my interaction with Christopher John, Chris, and Miranda Young, colleagues teaching in the theater department of the University of KwaZulu-Natal, who've had a lot of experience doing prison theater. Now this is worth thinking about at the institutional level in our context. Westville and the University of KwaZulu-Natal have a memorandum of understanding whereby faculty can teach in the prison and students as well can interact with prisoners on theater-related projects in the prison itself. This is, in my view, a radical ground for sustaining prison theater and for really radicalizing pedagogy on a long-term basis. It's an extraordinary infrastructure. My own specific experience at Westville was mediated by a devised theater piece. Devised theater means you create it from scratch. It's a collective kind of endeavor. There's no pre-written script. And this piece was being created by an all-male Zulu contingent of theater workers who were inmates of Medium B, a maximum security cell. I'm only going to focus on the first scene of this play. Please keep that in mind. And this was held in an empty chapel of Westville with no adornment beyond a cross, and I might add, with no Foucauldian panopticon surveillance whatsoever. Foucault does not have the last word in thinking about prisons. Okay, so I'm going to describe the scene. An inmate enters the performance space. Inmate, prisoner, center stage. He looks up at a tribunal of 3 imaginary interracial judges. So he's looking up as opposed to the woman I showed you in the TRC who is facing eye contact. There's a difference. He bows. My lords, my name is such and such. I am Zulu. You have accused me of rape. My lords, I have not raped. You're accusing me of rape because I'm black. Pause. Because you have accused me of rape, I will show you how to rape. What follows is a 3 to 5 minute physical enactment of rape with graphic gestures and violent movements. It's a demonstration, as it were. The inmate stops the action abruptly, bows ceremoniously, exits. The next inmate enters the performance space and begins an enactment of a different crime. Now, this is pretty harsh stuff, and I want to be clear here. This is only the first scene of the play. The second scene focused on the victim. The third scene focused on patriarchy and abusive family relationships and so on. So I'm only giving you a little glimpse, okay? Now, watching this enactment of rape was in all probability one of the most disturbing moments of performance that I've seen in my life. I've seen hundreds of performances. Most of them are forgotten. This 2-hour thing that I saw, I'll never forget for the rest of my life, never. What made it particularly unsettling was the fact that I was seeing this action not only with my own eyes, but through the eyes of the other inmates watching the action in total silence. You could cut the silence with a knife. I don't have words to describe that silence. Undeniably, at a dramaturgical level, this action is a provocation. It's a provocation on the lines of Georges Genet's The Blacks. Now, this is an extraordinary play by Genet, written for an all-black cast, okay, in which a section of the cast play a jury. He calls it a kangaroo court, a mock court, and they're in whiteface, and one of them is ritually murdered. So we're not doing the blacks here, but Genet is inspiration. And I said the action is a provocation, insofar as it works against the normal attempt in prison theater, which is often very palliative, to work towards rehabilitation and good citizenship with no serious confrontation of crime itself. For God's sake, these are killers. What are you going to do? Some kind of musical? You know, you have to address their lives. In the final presentation of the play, which I did see at Westville, to a large audience of prisoners, including the superintendent of police, there was a sequence towards the end of the play where the cast moved into the audience, like scattered in the audience, and formed small clusters of discussion groups to seek views on the need to generate peace cells at Westville. That was the agenda. I should have realized from the reticence, silence, and unease of the audience members, something was not working out. That night, Following the performance, there was a riot that broke out in Medium B, and the cell was shut down for the next 3 years. While it would seem that in our search for justice for prisoners as theater workers that we are challenged by the political authoritarianism of the prison administrators and guards, there is a more lethal form of authoritarianism represented by warring prison gangs who form a law unto themselves, a law embedded in primordial genealogies, rituals, and rules, which is perhaps more inaccessible than the institution of law that I had mentioned in my opening remarks, from which I acknowledged feeling excluded. It seems that the riot in Westville broke out on the orders of the Number, a criminal organization masterminding prison gangs, the 26s, the 28s, and a newly formed gang called the Forum that was attempting to advocate peace. It is likely that our theater group, whom Chris somewhat facetiously described as the non-gang gang, also belonged to one of these three gangs, but this disclosure was not possible in the workshop. So prison theater works with codes of secrecy. My own sense is that the directorial choice for recommending the formation of peace cells in the devised theater piece was premature and should have been strategized far more subtly, perhaps without directly threatening the existing hegemony of the gangs. I think it's a miscalculation at work here. While the search for justice at personal, interpersonal levels in the devised theater piece was on the right track, I do believe the inmates got a lot out of the piece performing it, but its dramaturgy needed to be more covert and self-reflexive and strategic. You have to be strategic when you're doing this kind of work in its advocacy of peace in a state of persistent, clandestine war. So I'm going to cut this section, unfortunately, on Bindu Nuweva in Sri Lanka, where a massacre took place in a rehabilitation center, horrible, horrible experience, incident, event. And this massacre took place 3 months after an international applied theater workshop was held in that center. And while I don't think there is a causal relationship between the holding of the workshop and the massacre, I do believe that the workshop played a role in sort of igniting tensions. We could talk about that maybe in the Q&A. So I'm going to go to the last part, the second wave. So we brought this up earlier in our discussion yesterday, that when we're talking about justice, you need different languages to talk about justice. You need different media to talk about justice. Maybe law is highly bound, is discursive and bound in words, but you're dealing with justice, which is something you want to implement in your classrooms, then you have to explore theater, and in this particular case, photography. Question: to what extent do photographs representing a crisis like a pandemic have the power to indict perpetrators of crime? How can images facilitate the process of justice? Beyond the capacity to elicit affect, yet again, how does one mobilize a juridical potentiality in and through images? Can one challenge the constraints and limitations of the law in re-examining its resistance to visual culture? Between March and May 2021, 166,623 people lost their lives in India on account of the COVID-19 virus. This is an official figure. So more people died in those 2 months than in the previous year. Against the specificity of this number, hundreds of people choked to death in the non-availability of oxygen during this time, even as there is no official data to verify the exact number. There is data, it's not official. I would regard the non-availability of oxygen during the pandemic as a crime. Oxygen is not a medicine or a vaccine. It is an essential life resource that one would expect to find in any hospital or medical center, particularly during a state of emergency. But given the fact that the Indian state's expenditure on health amounts to less than 1.25% of the GDP for 1.4 billion people, nothing has changed since the pandemic. This abysmal lack of investment in healthcare indicates that the state couldn't care less about the lives of people. In the COVID emergency, this amounted to nothing less than a brazen indifference to the right to life, which one would imagine should be of some concern to any self-respecting state. Instead, the glib response of, "There is no data," to account for deaths resulting from the non-availability of oxygen conveniently camouflages the state's absence of moral responsibility. While attempting to confront the deafening silence surrounding the deaths of millions of people during the pandemic, within the privileged confines of my home, I found myself needing not data, but what I came to formulate as evidence. Only I didn't use that word readily, as I found myself surfing hundreds of images of the most painful scenes of suffering, death, and loss, each of which resonated a harrowing story. I needed to engage with the scale of suffering at micro levels. Indeed, I could only deal with the scale of suffering at micro levels. Inevitably, this was a very deeply affecting experience. I found myself crying, but simultaneously questioning what it means to cry during a pandemic. With empathy, I realized the need for critique. And I share, Gayatri, these reservations about empathy. It can be insidious. And no one reminded us more about this than Bertolt Brecht in the theater, you know. So I think with empathy, there has to be critique. You've got to know, why are you crying, you know? During the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, one of the critiques was that tears and truth counter each other. I would suggest that we need to confront truth through our tears and to be ceaselessly vigilant about the mechanisms facilitating the affect of images so that our seeing doesn't just degenerate into self-indulgent voyeurism. I would like to look upon seeing as a political act. Needless to say, this critical alertness does demand some kind of prior knowledge that images today are owned by mega global corporations like Getty Images, which has absorbed the vast corpus of Bill Gates's Corbis images, amounting to millions of images. So what we see on our computer screens and smartphones is made possible through the strategic largesse, cunning, and monetary interests of global image producers and distributors. Arguably, they facilitate the consumerism of suffering, the knee-jerk capitulations to voyeurism, the residual memories of Orientalist horror, supplemented by new technology-driven sensations of flesh and blood in the moment. Arguably, all of this is part of one's, let's call it, post-colonial wisdom. However, the brute reality of watching these images during the pandemic, the brute reality, consciousness is one thing, but then you're seeing something that's doing something else. So this involved nothing less than seeing with one's eyes wide open what the state did not want us to see, preferring to anesthetize the pandemic in some kind of illusory state of systemic forgetting. The state wanted us to ignore what was happening around us. The images made us aware this was not possible. So in this state of contestation and unease, I'll show you some of the images that impacted on me, compelling me to think through and beyond the images. I don't have the time to do a detailed analysis of each of the images. Maybe in the Q&A we can do. So I'll let you see these images, and I'll just provide a few facts for the context, okay? So this is an image by Danish Siddiqui, Reuters photographer and Pulitzer Prize winner on 2 occasions, second time posthumous award. And it shows 2 unknown men sharing a hospital bed at the Lok Nayak Jaiprakash Hospital in Delhi at that precise point in time when oxygen was not available to hundreds of people. Tragically, a few months after this photograph was taken, Siddiqui was killed in Afghanistan in the crossfire between the Taliban and the government forces. In critical hindsight, perhaps something like a war resonates in this photograph. We could talk about that. This image by another Reuters photographer, Adnan Abidi, shows a man running through burning funeral pyres, which compels us to recall the sheer chaos and humiliation experienced in cremation grounds, where many people sometimes returned home from the cremation ground without the ashes of the loved one. What we see in the image is a man cowering and covering his eyes, his body bent in humiliation and fear as he flees the cremation ground. It's almost like he's running out of this frame. A lethal image, lethal not least because of its somewhat problematic aesthetics, and Walter Benjamin had forewarned us about this many, many years ago, how photography can transfigure the worst of realities. It's an image by Ritesh Shukla, an independent photographer. It takes some time for you to recognize what you're seeing here. It's nothing less abject than dead bodies stuck on the muddy banks of the Ganga. This is not the first time that bodies have been dumped in the Ganga. This happened also during the Spanish flu, but there's a difference, as historian David Arnold has told us, that we have no images of the Spanish flu in India. It's a very, very strange fact. But of course, today we have a multitude of images. An all too familiar scene of migrant laborers in a procession-like, interminable line heading home. I think the concept of home resonated a great deal during the pandemic. What is home? You know, is it a shelter? What is it? Is it a refuge? So if we have to read survival as resistance in this image, it lies in the tenacity of these bodies, their refusal to die, their resilience, their grit, even as the state would like them to disappear. The image shows us they're very much there. It's important. This is one of 3 images by Bandeep Singh, not of migrant laborers, but of clusters of families returning home across highways and state borders. And I ask you as teachers here, what memories are children likely to retain of this moment? You as teachers have had to deal with this at very immediate levels. But what happens to children who don't go to school at all? This one's a bit dark. This is a particularly poignant image by Atul Yadav of a migrant laborer who can be identified by a name, Ram Pukar Pandit. He is caught at a particularly tragic moment on Nizamuddin Bridge as he clutches his battered mobile to learn from his wife, calling from the village in Begusarai, that their less than 1-year-old son has died. Pandit has never seen his son. But to compound his sense of loss and desperation, he is prevented by the police from returning home. Can one blame him if he never wants to return to the city where there was no help for his condition? Of course, he may have returned to the city because he has to earn a living, but he didn't want to return to the city. There was no help. Just a declaration by the state. We all know this, let's repeat it. A declaration by the state that all migrant workers had to figure out their own ways of relocating in 4 hours with no provisions for transportation, food, or basic human care, even by authoritarian standards. This is extreme. Finally, an image on an Aadhaar card of a 12-year-old Adivasi girl who is better known as Jamlo Matkam. The name is different here, the birth date is clearly wrong. And Jamlo died of electrolyte imbalance and exhaustion while walking from a chili farm in Telangana, where she lost her job, to her home in Aded in the Bijapur district of Chhattisgarh. In this case, the state also serves as the official photographer, which authorizes Jamlo as a bona fide resident of India, though not necessarily a citizen. Its official verification of her identity also serves as a death certificate and an epitaph. An epitaph of child labor. So, these images are obviously steeped in pain, exemplifying instances of neglect, indifference, and gross injustice. Personally, I have no difficulty in reading evidence of human suffering in these images, drawing on the views by Roland Barthes, who emphasized that, quote, "A photograph has the capacity to attest that what I see has indeed existed. None of these photographs are photoshopped or distorted." However, while photographs, as Barthes would say, may deceive as to the meaning of the thing being photographed, it can never lie as to its existence. There are more skeptical readings of photography offered by postmodern theorists like Alan Secular, who would deny the objective truth of any photograph and its capacity to be used at a forensic level. Oddly enough, this ties up with the general ambivalence of the law in relation to photography on the basis that what we see in any photograph is not necessarily what we know. As legal scholar Jessica Silby points out, there's no fit between the inherent knowledge available in any image and its descriptive or analytical language of legal evidence and evaluation. She goes to the extent of saying, and she's right, lawyers are not trained to read images. Their expertise remains in the realm of the discursive, demanding the clarity, accuracy, and argumentative force of facts. I will not pursue this line of thinking except to acknowledge that not one of the images that I've shown you is likely to hold up as evidence in any court of law. And in this sense, they fail to indict the unacknowledged perpetrators who allowed people to suffer and die during the pandemic. Instead, the more widespread common sense would be that these images should be subsumed in the systemic forgetting and amnesia demanded of the state. What matters is that we get on with life, achhe din or not. My own argument would be these images are not likely to disappear, and I can only hope that they will continue to haunt the political unconscious. At a more idealistic level, I would also suggest that the juridical potentiality cannot be summarily written off, but we do need new strategies of assembling images with other forms of discursive evidence provided by activists. One way or the other, I would not give up on the law. Let us keep in mind that even during the worst days of the pandemic, and I draw here on an article by lawyers Abhinav Verma and Radhika Roy titled, "Why India Needs to Set Up a Truth Commission to Help It Really Heal from the COVID-19 Pandemic." Well, I'm sorry, I think the Truth Commission is not going to happen. We've never had a Truth Commission in India following any number of riots, any number of genocides. I think for a Truth Commission to happen, we go back to the first part. There has to be some kind of minimal consensus across warring parties, and there needs to be a practice of bipartisanship across politicians, across parties. Neither of these conditions can be fulfilled today in today's divisive political culture in India. But in this article by Verma and Roy, we learned some very important facts. The Madras High Court had reprimanded the Election Commission for failing to follow COVID-19 protocols, asserting that its officers should be booked for, quote, murder. The Allahabad High Court went further by stating that the death of COVID-19 patients due to non-supply of oxygen was, quote, a criminal act and no less than, quote, a genocide. These are very strong words coming from legal representatives that are defended, however, implicitly by senior legal scholar Professor Upendra Bakshi against charges of judicial overreach. So are we dealing with overreach here, or underreach, or no reach at all? If the law could do its job, including upholding its increasingly threatened autonomy against political interference and blackmail, we, as citizens of India, would have a better chance of living in a just society. Let the law do its work. We will do ours in civil society as teachers and cultural workers. If the law, however, fails its own mandate, then we have to mobilize, reconsolidate, re-strategize, reimagine our own efforts to seek justice in different forums and constituencies, as this lecture has attempted to inventory through experiments in truth and reconciliation, post-genocide peace building, applied theater in prisons, and photography. So, as I come to the end of a very long lecture, my apologies, what I have presented is not a success story, but experiments with truth driven by rage, resulting in what could be described as instances of positive failure. Failure that renews the need to struggle for a more just and humane society. Thank you.
Thank you for that absolutely wonderful, beautiful introduction to photography. I speak as a photographer.
Okay.
Historically, photography has had an extremely exalted position in the history of the world. You know that. Louis Hine changed New York and the child laborers. Walter Evans, the FSA photographer, the farm security photographers, changed the history of America during the Depression.
Right.
Photography has the capacity and the power because it's not ideological, it just says what it is. Having said that, the question is, do we as a culture don't know what to do with photographs, with evidence?
Well, I think what moved me very much about these photographers, they were not made by very famous, well, Danish Siddiqui and all are different. Most of them were press photographers. Press photographers are never given their due, you know. They're always kind of taken for granted. They are sometimes insulted, they're condescended to, you know. These guys were really risking their lives during the pandemic, you know. It's not easy to go be in a hospital during a pandemic, to be in a cremation ground, and I salute them. I mean, they have actually left behind an inventory of what happened. I'm very grateful to them. And these are sort of newspaper photographers. You want even Atul Yadav or the others. These are very simple soldiers on the ground, I would say, you know, who wanted to do their work, you know. And I'm very moved by their contribution. Yes. Let's have another question. Okay. Yeah. Later we'll talk.
Sir, thank you so much for the talk. So my question is, I'm just going to take 1 minute to very quickly relate an experience from the pandemic.
Please.
Because for me, the experience of education, I was in school during the pandemic, was education became very, very invasive.
Yeah.
Because you had videos on a Zoom conference. It was something, it was very difficult to confront. And I think, and my mother is someone that's in teaching. It's invasive both for the student and the teacher going through something that is very, very traumatic. And just because you spoke about the importance of images, there are two images that are there in my home. They are two very different. So they're happening in the same space, but the image won't relate that it's in the same building. Same room, in fact. So my grandmother wasn't, she didn't get access to a hospital. And she passed away at home. And towards the end, we couldn't even procure oxygen. And after that, there was a lot of trouble getting the doctor to issue a death certificate, getting the body. So the body was there. And I had to attend a meeting, part of an educational institution. So I was sitting, and that was the quietest room, because there's a ruckus going on, trying to negotiate with a policeman, with a doctor, all over the phone. I'm sitting in the same room as a corpse, and I'm part of a meeting, so just to paint a picture. How are we to negotiate? So when we return to that institution, as you said, we have to confront what has happened. And as teachers, as students, all of us, to some degree, have had experiences like this. How are we to confront that kind of rage, which we both feel? And we can't, I really don't like the terminology of everything's back to normal, because it isn't. And how do we confront that rage towards education that became so invasive in that small period of time? And how do we translate that anger, essentially, back in a classroom with young students, with young children who've gone through so much?
Thank you so much for that sharing. I think translating that rage, obviously you can't bring that rage into the classroom, unmediated. There has to be a translation, and this is where translation, a profound concept. How do you do it, what kind of story do you tell? Do you share your own story? It might be too harsh for the children, you have to be very careful about what you're subjecting them to, I can only say that this is real, that what you went through, that there was no medical, facility available for your grandmother, bless her. This is wrong, in my view. It's wrong, But how do we get this across, in a more legal kind of language? We're also dealing with very intangible dimensions that the law has no language for, and that's grief. I don't think the law has any language for grief, and the perpetuation, the longevity of grief, your suffering, The law wants its facts, it works differently. I'm not trying to undermine that, but, well, what can I say? You have to get it out. This is my feeling. There has to be a time when you find the right moment, you get the students together and say, I want to share something with you, You have to find that moment. I don't know whether this is easily done in your, very strict schedules. I have done very difficult workshops with students. I have to find the time. One workshop was on secrets, and it was sparked by the fact that one of the students, women in the class, was divorced, okay? And she told me in the dining, sir, I'm divorced. I said, yes, I know. Everyone knows, but we don't talk about it, okay? And I felt it was important to get that out, but you have to find a mode. And this is where I will say that a language of theater can help. It can certainly help. We were talking yesterday of the middle ground. Yes, please. Yeah, the middle ground.
Sir, please continue. You were saying something.
No. I was just saying that theater can help in such situations, because it provides you with a somewhat different language to deal with essential realities, okay? And that doesn't mean there's perfect truth or anything like that, but it enables you to enact certain things. Like what I said of the prisoners, That was enormously helpful for them. Enormous. And that silence that I was talking about when they were watching that rape, it was profound. It was very deep. It was, they were confronting something in themselves. Yes, please.
So in that light, as a teacher, my concern's always been with how I can use what is being said here in my teaching practice. So you mentioned Augusto Ball, and his theatre of the oppressed and forum theatre are tools that have been used to help citizens who have been oppressed find their voice, and to help them actually work with the difficulties and come up with solutions. And with the introduction of the character of the Joker and things like that. So I was wondering, and I want to think a little bit about, perhaps it was necessary in prison theatre for catharsis, but I want something that's beyond catharsis. It's not mere catharsis. That is there a way by which this sense of justice can be brought through theatre in this manner in school life? And how can we go about it?
You need some expertise here. I don't think we can completely, discount the fact that, you need some training, to figure out how these translations can take place, I would maybe begin with a courtroom, It's a very old standard method of dramatizing events, You're the witness, you're the lawyer, you're the judge, Let's deal with a situation around, take an everyday incident, some kind of real, no water, Yes.
So a couple of boys were changing for a play, and a couple of girls entered the room, and the boys felt that was a deliberate act, and they were very upset. And they said, if the case had been reversed, you would have held us accountable. You would have told us that we were violating the girls' rights.
Yes.
So so I've given you an example of a situation.
Yes. Difficult to take that real life, that's what I said. Be careful of the backlash. This is something that I've learned, You have to pitch your intervention very carefully. You've got to prepare the ground for that intervention, We could talk later about this. I think it needs some guidance. I'm thinking of a friend that many of us know, Maya Krishna Rao, who has worked in schools and who works with history chapters and other things. But when you're dealing with these very small but potent moments, it can be more delicate.
If I can ask the next question. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, let her ask. Thank you. Your presentation has touched us profoundly and has shaken us as well. I have a question and a comment. Of course, TRC was meant to take the country out from a divided past to a shared future, and it didn't obviously do that. But between collective amnesia and the perpetual cultivation of grievance, how can theatre establish that delicate balance? That moment where I'd say that the, despair becomes unconvincing and hope practical, especially in the classroom. Is it possible? The second question is, yes, of course, the pain on our planet is sometimes overwhelming, and you chose very, very disturbing images. I wondered why you didn't think of the langars that ordinary citizens had sort of put together to offer food and service to people who needed comfort and succor. Does that in some senses disturb the narrative, or does it balance it? You spoke about the middle path, which is why
I think the langar and those supportive gestures coming from one community to another, open to all, what could be better, These are not programmed. I don't look upon this as performance. I look upon this as social action. I look upon this as acts of generosity. For me, everything is not a performance, you know. I have a real problem with performance studies, my discipline, because they tend to include everything becomes a performance, and where the hell, how do you draw the line, you know? No, I think this is seva, you know. These are acts of generosity. These are concrete actions that feed the movement. And my God, they're huge. What you can learn from ordinary people, you know, rallying in states of emergency is simply humbling. It's not something we are always capable of. Let's be quite clear about that. I think for the classroom, it can never be a one-off. There has to be continuity. You know, it has to go through the semester. It cannot be seen as extracurricular, you know, and, you know, or give the students some kind of, you know, taste of theater. No. We want them to think at the end of the day. That's what the point is, to think reflexively and caringly, you know. And I think that's why you need this institutional mediations to pick up those things. You need very strong support from the principal. You need strong support from the teachers. You have to work with them, not just with the students and the syllabus. Yes, please. There was a question there.
Can I go up? I'll hand over the mic after. So my question was that in your talk, there seemed to be a sense that you really believe in retributive justice, that if there is a violation, there has to be some form of punishment, which is what you said in the beginning. I find that a little hard to grapple with, especially in cases like the Rwandan genocide, apartheid in South Africa, which are, you know, historical violations that have gone on for several hundreds of years. And the idea to me of retributive justice is, if there is a violation, then the punishment to it will in some way like equate or you know, assuage what has happened. And I find that very difficult to grapple with, because how can you correct the violation, or even a small minor violation like a sexual assault? Like, how can putting a person in prison solve what has happened to you? So I really believe in the idea of transformative justice, and I think that has come from a tradition of many indigenous cultures I know in the United States, but I'm sure in other parts of the world as well, which I'm less familiar with. So I'm wondering how can you think of law as such a like, on the one hand you're talking of theater as this other form of justice, other form of reckoning, cultural reckoning, but at the same time you seem to believe so deeply in the idea of retributive justice, where there is this other path of thinking of transformative justice as forgiveness, as like a cultural forgiveness of something that has happened and finding your peace with it. That can also be seen as justice by many communities.
Yes.
So yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'm wary that when I was saying retributive justice, I was sticking my neck out. But as I also balanced it immediately with restorative justice, and most of my examples are working in the field of restorative justice, I think some action has to happen, you know, in restorative justice. Very often, Gandhiji is the model here, you know, like during the partition, you know, if somebody has burned down the house of somebody else, but you rebuild that house, you know, you do something, you know, very concrete. I can only say that without punishment, and when you see perpetrators of crime walking the streets normally as if nothing has changed in their life, is the most horrendous experience that you can possibly face. I'm sorry. I don't want to see criminals on the street, and not just on the street, but in positions of power. You know, some accountability has to be there. But yes, there is proportionality. I certainly do not believe in capital punishment. I might add that both these countries, South Africa and Rwanda, have abolished capital punishment. We have not. So when I say punishment, that's a horrible word. It's like loaded. But how can that be, I would like to say, balanced, you know, with forms of education, you know? But I'm not going to allow a criminal to be scot-free. Sorry, I think there are too many criminals in our lives who just get away with their crimes. And I don't think that's going to create any transformation. Think of South Africa. There's no reconciliation there. I would say if we had to, I have to do more work on this, but Rwandan experiment today is paid off better. I would like to make that very, very sensitive point. South Africa's, the rhetoric is there, constitutional court, this, that, the other, but nothing has changed. Nothing has changed at ground levels. You just have this, the old guard once again, you know, in positions of power. And nothing has changed in the townships. It's worse than before, you know. It's still divided. There's no economic, of course, this is not retributive justice. We're talking of, well, economic redistribution, which is what Maletsi and Mbeki. That's, can the law really enforce that? Perhaps not. You know, this is a political task, you know. That hasn't happened. So I'd like to see, yes, transformative justice, but let's not allow killers to get away with their crimes. This is what I would believe in. Yes, please, there was another question.
Yeah. So during the pandemic, you have seen that there was a form of selective inclusion going on social media, in the TV channels, the news channels. So we have seen that maybe, you know, celebratory forms of performances from different locations of the world have been brought about and I think consciously propagated in order to limit the rage and facilitate cultural amnesia. So how do we actually negotiate that, you know, the two forms of performances which are at odds with each other, where the state machinery is, you know, consciously propagating one form of performance in order to limit the other, in order to limit the rage caused by the other performance?
I'm not getting the question.
For example, if I might draw an example, there was one video by Gurdeep Pandhar from Canada.
Yes.
So that video was circulated in India at a point of time. That was he was dancing Bhangra due to the joy caused by the first dose of vaccination. But that was, you know, circulated in India at a wide scale during a time when we did not even, you know, understand or hope that we will, you know, a large population will be vaccinated.
Yes.
Or maybe we have seen how the Central Ministry has propagated some idea of celebratory violence like banging plates and all, and those have been covered, you know, time and again by the...
Okay, I get your point.
Yeah.
Oh my God. Who was the greatest director during the pandemic? I think it was our Prime Minister, right? He was calling the shots. What a performance, you know? Lights out, 9 minutes banging of plates, pots, whatever, you know? Light diyas, whatever. This is masterminding, you know? And this is very, very, we have to contrast these sort of masterminded, state, top-heavy kinds of celebratory performances with the actual celebrations that did take place during the pandemic. Let's not forget it. They were impromptu, they were around neighborhoods, it involved singing. Beautiful examples all across the world, I'm very aware. Opera, from in Italy, this out-of-work opera actors singing from Traviata or whatever. It's just beautiful. You know, these are kinds of individual needs for solidarity and so on. But we have to contrast this with this other kind of state-determined, you know. I mean, it was unbelievable. Lights out. You know, now we all know in the theater how important it is to get the lights out. You never get a perfect blackout in the theater, let me tell you. Not possible. The management will object to it. But if the Prime Minister says lights out for the next 8 minutes, it's possible. My God, you know, you're humbled. Who is calling the shots? Who is doing the theater? So it's not just a theater in the prison, it's the theater of the state, you know, that we have to be talking about. Yep. Kya bolega?
Thank you for that enlightening talk, and I just have a minute. Megha's given me a minute, so I won't take long. This is just a comment to teachers who are looking for transformative justice, students who are looking for transformative justice, and teachers who want to use and apply performance and theater and the creative arts within your spaces in schools. I work as an art psychotherapist, and there are new emergent fields now in India, such as drama therapy. There's the drama therapy India. I teach a program at the St. Xavier's College in Mumbai, where they have an expressive arts therapy program. we are developing these fields to really address issues within schools, within prisons. There's a lot of work happening with minority groups. I've worked in observation homes. There's work happening with minor sex workers. So these are the fields, these are the new age fields which are emerging as a result of mental health issues that are on the uprise in India. So I would really encourage you all that if you all are interested, I'm around today, and we can get into these sort of a dialogue or discussion around this. And it really speaks to some of the issues which cannot be resolved. I really believe that a new language needs to emerge, as you have pointed out as well, and really creative arts can lend itself to becoming that new voice and that new language.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. With that, I think we are out of time for this session. So thank you so much, Rustom, for your wonderful talk.
Thank you.
Before we head to coffee break, I just we have some disappointing news. We will not be able to have the next session because Menaka Guruswamy has been unavoidably detained today, so she will not be joining us. So we will be moving into the final conversation after a half-an-hour coffee break.
No, it's disappointing. No problem. Was it bored?